all be about on-road bicycle facilities. So where we were previously discussing off-road facilities, now we're looking at bringing bike lanes onto the carriageway and looking at best practice within that space. A few things I just wanted to touch on that we didn't get time in the last session, which is regarding lighting of shared paths. This is a shared path that is in Melbourne, and it's quite an innovative approach to, illuminate the shared path. The little lights are underneath the rail. You can kind of see them, those little things there. And they are directed to obviously cast their light purely onto the path so as not to, cast light into adjacent neighbouring properties, which is businesses, restaurants, property boundaries and things like that. So really clever idea, because it's basically making sure that the light is where it needs to be so you can see any hazards that could be on the path itself without having to interact or interfere with any of your property's boundaries. And this actually won a Good Lighting Award in 2020. So this one is in Brunswick. Just a clever solution if you are working within this space and trying to work out how to light your shared paths. Another example I just wanted to share, I was talking a lot about using zebra crossings where you're crossing, so we've got pedestrian priority crossing over a bicycle path. So a bicycle path, it's kind of going up and along here, but you're using a zebra crossing at those specific points to communicate to cyclists that you need to slow down and this is where pedestrians have right of way. So yeah, just to reiterate that you can use zebra crossings across bike lanes. They're not just exclusively for the carriageway, they can be installed there with the supplementary signage. The other thing I wanted to mention about this particular site is you may have noticed that there's these little like transverse pavement bars, as they're referred to. And that's just another way of I suppose, alerting cyclists to the conflict point that something is changing within the environment. They actually provide a bit of a haptic warning. So by haptic, I mean like you can feel it. You can feel it in your handlebars and in your hands that there's a surface change there. So just a further indication for cyclists that they need to slow down within this space. All right. For those that did manage to watch the 360-degree footage from our first module, you would have noticed that there were two examples of a shared path crossing a road, example 1, example 2. And Marissa, we might launch our first poll of the day just to get everyone stuck into it. The question is, which example shows best practice design for a shared path crossing a road? And this one, these poll questions aren't actually marked as part of your assessment. It's just for engagement, just keeping everyone part of the conversation. So feel free to pop your answer in the poll. Hopefully that's popped up on your screen. And I'll find my pen. We've nearly got everyone participating. We've just got a few more people to answer that question. All right. So we've got nearly a full cohort with us answering example 1, which is the example on the left there. And I would agree with that. I think it's wonderful to see that we have this raised crossing facility And for those who did watch the video, you may have noticed that vehicles do slow down, and they did acknowledge that this is a crossing point and they are forced to give way. That's a give way sign there for motorists. Whereas if you look at example 2, this idea of just forcing cyclists to, just telling cyclists that their shared path ends, that's all done, and then it's up to you to get across there before it starts up again, is just, not a very continuous outcome for cyclists and not a very comfortable situation. So definitely try to implement example 1 where possible, providing that priority, as well as, having that raised feature and just making it a much smoother ride to get across. Len noticed in the video that the pedestrian was on the phone and didn't even look. There you go. That's very well spotted, Len. Today's session, we are, as mentioned, talking about on-road facilities. So we'll be getting very much into the topic of protected bicycle lanes, which would be considered best practice if you are able to provide Copenhagen lanes, as they're often referred to as well. That's considered kind of the gold standard. We'll discuss the risks of providing on-road bicycle lanes, in particular the risk of dooring and how that may be mitigated. A few other treatments that are within designers' arsenal. And finally, we'll go into environments where it may be appropriate to actually mix general traffic and cyclists as well. So we're talking about low traffic volumes and low speeds as well, and how to manage those situations. Marissa.
Yes, we have a question from Tom. Is the raised yellow platform incorporated in the road rules?
So this, good question. The yellow is actually in all places in a VicRoads road design note for raised safety platforms. So it's not necessarily to do with shared paths explicitly, but they do recommend using that yellow color within Victoria to indicate a shared path. So we can provide that document if you'd like there, Tom. And for other jurisdictions, there are other measures, other colors that are used. So it's, just a little bit of, just to make things more difficult, they've introduced a new color kind of thing. Any legal implications? So I'm not aware that the yellow has any legal implications, no. So it's not like a zebra crossing where that pavement marking actually denotes pedestrian priority. I don't believe the yellow does. So it's not like within the road rules, sorry. Yeah.
We've got a comment. What about the green color?
Yeah, so it is the green color also could be used. It's not uncommon to see a green kind of bicycle path there, and then adjacent a zebra crossing. We actually have a few examples of that in next modules session, so we can have a look what that looks like later on. But it is possible to have those two kind of side by side. So you've got a cyclist facility there, and then adjacent a zebra crossing.
Yeah. We have a few comments from Chris. It's the signs that provide priority. From Catherine, the road rules would be under the use of the giveaway signage.
Absolutely.
We have another question. Can we use that as shared path color as well?
There'd be nothing to stop you from using that. It is being used in this instance to denote the conflict point, so as to raise awareness of, vulnerable road users within that area. If you wanted to paint the entire area, the Australian standards, they do recommend only implementing it where the conflict point exists. So, not using too much of it, because that might then reduce the impact of what you're trying to say, because you're only trying to use it for areas where there are conflicts. So I suppose, there needs to be a bit of sensibility of how much you apply.
And we have another comment. Refer to VicRoads road design notes 03, 07 for yellow SUP crossings, etc.
Yes, that's the one I was after. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thanks everyone for your comments there.
Excellent. Okay, so we'll get stuck in. All right, so a protected bicycle lane. Here's an example of what one looks like. This is actually a very good example of what one looks like. And the kind of key feature within a protected bicycle lane is traditionally the way bicycle lanes are built is you'd have a parked vehicle up against your curb and channel. So that vehicle would usually be parked there. And then the bicycle lane would be adjacent the parked vehicle. The issue that we have with that type of traditional design is you're putting cyclists within the dooring zone. So as soon as drivers open their door, they're opening it into a bicycle lane. And also cyclists to the right of them, they have live traffic. So there's, adjacent traffic, moving traffic to worry about as well. You've got those two kind of considerable risks for cyclists within traditional bicycle lane design. With a protected bicycle lane, you've actually flipped those. So instead, we've got cyclists riding in this protected facility, which is separated usually through the use of curbs and concrete infill, and I'll go through a range of other materials that can be used within that space, but providing that separation so as to remove the risk of live traffic, getting them away from the live traffic lane and also away from the dooring zone. So it's just a wonderful facility to be advocating for and designing. The reason I think that this one is such a good example is because this is actually, once again, a common commuter route into Melbourne CBD. And you'll see it's wide enough to allow the two cyclists to ride abreast. And I think that's a really clever thing to be doing for routes that do have, a strategic importance, because what you'll invariably face is some cyclists will travel slower, some cyclists will travel faster. If this was a very narrow facility where it only allow one at a time, one cyclist at a time, you basically created this tunnel where you wouldn't allow cyclists to overtake slower cyclists. So that can create a little bit of tension, and it can lead to risky behaviors, trying to overtake in situations where perhaps it's not safe to do so. So where your carriageway width permits and you do have the space to provide this wider facility that enables two cyclists cycling abreast, I think is a really great outcome. Just on some, I suppose, subjective analysis of protected bicycle lanes, there was a study completed in the city of Melbourne to suggest that about 83% of people feel comfortable or confident to ride within a protected bicycle lane. If we compare that to what is a traditional bicycle lane, there's only about 22% of people that feel comfortable in that space. So it's a markedly larger audience that you are attracting when you are building protected lanes. So it's no longer just the super confident, people that can ride anywhere and don't really, they feel very comfortable in that space. You're also attracting to others that, perhaps new to cycling or always want to be in a protected environment. So you're just catering for a broader range of skills. So that is I suppose a subjective analysis of why you would be implementing these types of things, because particularly if you're looking at strategically, if your objective for a project is to capture the needs of the broader community and not for a specific skill set, then protected lanes are just an excellent way to achieve that. There's a few configurations that you can look for within your protected bicycle lanes. One is using it's just referred to as a one-way path, which just means cyclists can travel in one direction, which is the same direction as the nearest adjacent traffic lane. So this cyclist on the left is traveling into the screen, and on the opposite side of the carriageway, we have a cyclist traveling out of the screen. pretty common arrangement to have this, you know, bike lanes on either side of the road. It does have its, I suppose, actually, I might hop into the next slide where we talk about the bidirectional facility, and then I can explain where you may go for either approach. But this is what I'd be seeing as quite a common way to design protected bicycle lanes. Here's just an example of how this may look, and I might pop this to a question for the group as well. You may notice that these kind of separators that are being used, they kind of always have these breaks in them. See how there's that break in them? It's not just one continuous slab of concrete. Any ideas why there would be that break in the separator? Open up to anyone in the chat. Oh, all right. Well, I see lots and lots of drainage, which is 100% correct. So absolutely, that's a very, very common design detail within this space, is just to leave those gaps in the separators so as not to create pooling issues. If this was, you know, one solid curb and channel there, then water wouldn't have anywhere to go and it'd pool within this car park, or you'd have to build new, you know, pits and conduits to pipe the water away from there, which can be very expensive. So if you just provide those gaps, then you can utilize your existing drainage network to get rid of all that stormwater. Marissa?
Yes, we have another question. What would you consider as an absolute minimum width of a raised separated median between bike lane and traffic parking lane?
I'm not sure I heard all of that. Sorry, Marissa.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. It might have been my...
Hearing me right? We'll try this again.
Yeah.
What would you consider as an absolute minimum width of a raised separated median between bike lane and traffic parking lane?
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Yep. So we are talking about what would the minimum width here be? And I'll talk about the desirable first, because I think we should, you know, try and aim for that wherever possible. And a door can actually swing open to about 1.2 to 1.5 meters. So it's pretty far. So if you're able to provide that as your minimum, that would be the best outcome, because what you've essentially done is you've removed the risk of dooring. Even if it was to fully swing open, it wouldn't enter the bicycle lane. So that would be, you know, completely removing the risk altogether, which is the best outcome. I have seen narrower ones, and I've got slides in this deck which will show narrower separator arrangements. And my suggestion would be to, I suppose, risk rates what are the consequences of adopting a smaller, you know, separation there. Like, for instance, if there's a high turnover of parking and you're expecting a lot of those doors to be opening, that would increase the risk of, you know, a dooring collision. If it was all day parking, and, you know, those are areas where you may be able to push the separator width to become a little bit narrower. But yeah, there's a few examples coming up which might give you a bit of inspiration there.
Okay, we have another question. What is the difference between a protected bicycle lane and bicycle path?
Difference between a protected bicycle lane and a bicycle path, I would say they're jargon that kind of overlap quite commonly. Yeah. I don't think there's one or the other. I think it's just a different way of referring to it.
Different terminology. Yep. We've got a comment. Given the recent rain we had and the issue of flooding, a lot of these bike paths would be non-trafficable due to flooding. Something to think about. Another comment, also need to think about an appropriate width for passenger to step on as they alight, may be frail, etc. And a question from Tom, issues and solutions regarding waste collection and street sweeping on protected bike path.
Yes, that is a very pertinent issue. So say this is a residential street and you did need to get your garbage bins collected. There is that issue of, well, where do you put your garbage bins? Do you put it where you always put it, which is on the footpath? Is the garbage truck able to access that? Likely not. So then do you put it up here? Is that a place that's easy to access? You have to cross over the bike path. So that's also not a really feasible solution. What I've seen done in quite a few jurisdictions is actually allocating spots within the separation to say, this is where the bin goes. And it's not raised. So it's just at level and say, you just hatch it to make sure there's no parking there, or you can, draw out, this is where the bin goes, just to make it incredibly clear. Yeah, to avoid any confusion. And I think also what's most important is, discussing how these changes will affect local residents, because they won't be able to just put their bins where they used to be able to. The other question was just regarding the street sweeping. This one I would suggest would likely have to be done under traffic management, where you'd actually have to close off the traffic lane, and whether you could get either one of those really narrow, small street sweepers that can fit within this space, depending on the size of your facility, or you get one that runs along here and then has an arm that kind of sweeps that all up. But just one of the many considerations that you need to work through when looking at implementing these features.
And Max, if the protected bicycle lane next to the footpath is like this, then how do you deal with the driveway?
Another good question. So there actually could be a driveway here in this photo. I'm not really too sure, but obviously that access would need to be maintained. You wouldn't just be looking at blocking those things off. So that's, probably is a driveway, considering, see how it's got the green conflict paint indicating that there's a point, that's where vehicles will be crossing. So that's a very, very common way to highlight that risk. Other things you'd want to be looking at is, where does this parking bay end? If it's too close, then it makes this sweep or this turn into a driveway very, very difficult. It could increase the risk of rear end crashes if you have to really slow down to get into your driveway now, or, colliding with the parked vehicle altogether. The other thing is, the further you can set back that parking lane, sorry, I've got drawings everywhere now though, but the further you can set that back, the more opportunity you have for opening up those sight lines. So particularly, both for vehicles entering the driveway and exiting, to be able to see cyclists in that lane or live traffic going through there as well. So these aren't areas where you would completely expect to see no access to driveways. Generally, it's just managed through those measures that I mentioned. Oh, is it Marissa? Okay, cool. I'll keep going. This was the other configuration that you can opt for when looking at protected bicycle lanes, and this is referred to as a bidirectional path. And it basically enables cyclists to travel in both directions on one side of the road. So it's a reasonably, it makes a lot of sense in certain circumstances. Where this would be a most appropriate solution is where all the attractions and amenities are on one side of the carriageway. An example of this could be a primary school and, a library, the Esplanade or a railway station or whatever it is. All of that happens to be on one side of the carriageway. The other side of the carriageway could be residential, or it could be, business or industry or whatever it is. Not to say that there isn't demand for it, for cyclists to be on that side, but the main attraction are on one side of the carriageway. That's a really strong incentive to be looking at your bidirectional path, as opposed to putting one on each side. Got another question for the group coming up, which is, Here's a facility which is, I believe this one's in Sydney. And you'll notice that the separator for this one is much narrower. So we were talking about that width before. Any ideas why this particular road environment installed a narrower separating strip? So before we had that 1 meter or 1.5 meter, I'll give you a minute to have a think about that. Right, I can certainly see lots of similar thinking there, which is there is no parking there. I mentioned before that we do allow for that width to cater for a fully open door. If we don't have that parked vehicle there, then we can look to narrow that separation. I agree with the other suggestions there saying that's, well, existing traffic lane widths and, you know, just using what the existing carriageway looks like. So I think that's also relevant, but I think the main driving factor is if there was parking here, you probably wouldn't opt for that. You would try and get something wider in there. So well done for those that noticed. Maybe the first person there, Marissa, that mentioned no parking, we can give a prize out to.
No worries.
Thank you very much. Yes. So
that might be Chris Hall. Well done, Chris Hall.
Oh, it was Chris. Oh, well done, Chris. A few other considerations when tossing up between our single lane and bi-directional bicycle lane. You can use this table later on if you're ever within this space, but I might just skip over it because it's easier to talk to this through slides. Here's an example of a vehicle that's exiting a driveway. It could be a car park, or it could be a residential access, or it could be a minor street for all intents and purposes. I should also clarify, this is from an American guideline, so driving on the right-hand side of the road here. But this is all just one-way traffic heading this way. Intuitively, that driver is focused on vehicles traveling in that direction because that's where they need to enter. So that's the conflict that they're worried about, which means their line of sight is heading towards the north or up on the screen. So if there's a cyclist traveling along this direction, it's likely they'd be able to spot them, or, you know, they'd be in their line of sight. It's unlikely they're thinking about cyclists traveling in that direction. It's just not really, I suppose, because they're not incredibly common to have these bi-directional facilities. It's not really within the psyche or what we're used to check kind of both ways crossing over these facilities. So that's one of the risks associated with bi-directional paths, is just a driver's, you know, unaware to look both ways when crossing over that facility. Another risk associated with the bi-directional, this one is a vehicle that's turning right into a minor leg. So it could be to access a minor street or a car park, just like before, but instead of exiting, we're entering it. And it's a very, very similar philosophy where that driver is focused on that vehicle there. That's where their line of sight is, understandably. To a lesser extent, they will have cyclists in that direction within their field of view and I suppose what they're thinking about. Incredibly difficult for that right turn vehicle to be able to see that circled yellow cyclist because they're heading in the same direction. It's to the right of them and it's likely in their blind spot. So very, very difficult to be able to adequately sight them. One way you could look to mitigate this as a risk, which is kind of shown within this example, is if you provide a bit of space there. So this right turn vehicle can prop and then wait and give way to cyclists at that point and then cross, rather than just do it all in one right-hand turn. That is a way that you could use to mitigate this as a risk. Acknowledge that that would be difficult to achieve. You know, when retrofitting a lot of our sites, just you wouldn't have that space available, but something to consider if you are looking to implement bi-directional paths. I'm not trying to put anyone off implementing bi-directional, because I do think they have advantages. I think there's an excellent facility up in Bendigo that uses this, that also uses protected roundabouts, which we'll talk about in a few modules times. But I do think that there is advantages using bi-directional paths, but there are also other risks that come with it. So just important to acknowledge both. All right, I was going to spend a bit of time chatting through some different separators. Marissa, did you want to jump in?
We just have a few comments there on the bidirectionals. This is why I don't think bidirectionals are appropriate when there are driveways.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and from Lynn, sorry, you go.
No, I was going to say, if it was driveway, and you continue to have that risk, like this risk that we're talking about here with a right turning vehicle, maybe you'd look to do it one way. But if it's kind of sporadically, then you could conceivably do a design like this, but understand where you're coming from.
Yeah. We have another comment from Len. Also, a large tree requires vehicles to stick their nose out onto bike lane.
Yep, that's true. Yep, so motorists may be tempted just to, you know, keep heading out and to open up their sight lines. If there's vegetation or whatever, they're blocking it, and they'll keep going out, potentially blocking the bike lane. So, yep, I agree.
Thanks, Max. That's all for now.
No worries. So often when we talk about our protected bicycle lanes, we tend to have an image of something that looks like this, these type of separators. Just wanted to acknowledge that there are other products or other treatments out there that can be used to provide that separation. But before I go into that, just a bit more detail on your separation. So one thing to consider is what curb profile you would adopt. So for those that haven't got into the world of curb profiles, there's this very common curb, which is called a barrier curb, which is what's presented in the first photo there. Then we have another type of barrier, which is called a semi-mountable, which, as the name suggests, it allows traffic to mount that type of curb. So when would you apply one, and why would you do that? Well, in an ideal world, you would have on a bike lane, so I'm looking at my photo on the right-hand side here, on a bike lane, you'd have something that is semi-mountable. And that means if a cyclist were to be running off road or, you know, just losing control a little bit, they're not going to strike a barrier curb, which is just a flat vertical surface. That would most likely result in a cyclist coming off their bicycle. So if you are able to provide something that is semi-mountable on the bike lane, that's a great outcome. However, you don't want to have that semi-mountable feature on the parking lane side. The reason being, vehicles will park on it. So you want to make it difficult for the vehicles to get up on there, but you don't want to make it difficult for cyclists. So that's what's shown in the photo on the right-hand image, where you've got a semi-mountable profile on the bike lane side and a barrier curb on the parking lane side. And just to show you a few examples of what happens if this profile is not adopted. So on the bike lane side, this is a protected bicycle lane. We have got the semi-mountable barrier, which looks, semi-mountable curb, which on the bike lane side is a big tick, but it's also installed on the car parking side, which means vehicles are very likely to just park on the separator, and then it no longer achieves that purpose of the separator. So it is designed to separate parked vehicle traffic from the bicycle lane, but now they're much, much closer to our bicycle lane, which means we haven't really removed that risk of dooring. You can also get silly things like this that happen where motorists, well, this is just an obvious attempt of, I'm going to park wherever I want to, and I'm not going to listen to any road rules, but just another thing that can happen within this space. That's just a photo of what that looks like at night. So yeah, just to clarify, that's the barrier curb. If that had been installed on this side as well, would have been much less likely of vehicles mounting that to park. The other thing I wanted to have a quick chat about is just considering how disabled parking bays will be able to be designed alongside our protected bicycle lanes. Because if we consider that separator, well, that is, a stepping hazard or a tripping hazard for pedestrians. And for those with, disabilities or impaired movement, the act of stepping over the separator may be unfeasible, may not be accessible at all. So that's particularly relevant where we're thinking about disability bays. So if you were designing protected bicycle lanes adjacent any disabled parking bays, you definitely want to have a gap in your separators there. The other thing you want to be doing is providing a pram ramp or equivalent to ensure that people using those bays are able to access the adjacent footpath. So you don't want to just keep it in there for you don't want to just keep it in there and have to, travel up in the bike lane to then get up onto the footpath. You want to make sure it's in a convenient location. Here's an example of not such a good practice. I'll just zoom in a little bit so it's a bit clearer to see. So once again, it's that idea of putting a little zebra crossing across a bike lane, which is a good idea to suggest that pedestrians have priority across the bike lane. What's not so well done is there's no pram ramps on either side of this. So pedestrians are actually forced to step down onto the bike lane and then step back up to get to the bus stop or vice versa, which is not very accessible. A better way to have achieved this would to have raised this whole section up. So this is one continuous level for pedestrians, and that means creating like a ramp or a little wombat crossing for cyclists. So once again, slowing down cyclists and really achieving that objective of ensuring that they know that this is a place where pedestrians have priority and it's not just their bike lane. All right, I'll hop back into our discussion of separators. So this was another treatment that was shown before, but just these kind of bolt down separators. Good thing about these is they can just be, bolted into the pavement and used as trials, which I'm sure many people are familiar with or may have seen these products going in and different locations around Australia and New Zealand. So yeah, that's a good option. As we mentioned before, most likely being used where our protected bicycle lanes are not next to a parking lane. So there's no risk of dooring. Obviously, in an ideal world, the greater separation you can provide, even if it isn't adjacent parking lane, the greater separation, it's still a more comfortable experience for cyclists. So this is bi-directional as well. If you're riding here and there's vehicles driving here, it can still be a little bit edgy, it can feel a bit uncomfortable riding in such close proximity. Another common separator that is being used is things like planter beds, which I I'm a big greenie and I've got lots of planter beds in my garden, but I would generally like to see a limited application within the urban environment, purely because it's incredibly common to see these things look fantastic on day one when they're installed, and then 6 months later, with no maintenance or anything like that, they just they look terrible. And also, once they grow and grow and grow, they may grow into the bicycle lane, or they may leave debris in the bicycle lane. So, not saying you can't do it, but there are, you know, maintenance implications as well with this approach. This one's in New Zealand, so this is kind of using a combination of very, very colourful planter boxes and using some kind of bolt down separated treatment as well. And also, similar to one of that issue that I was talking about there, where, you know, perhaps vehicles are colliding with these planter boxes, and we've got this issue of, you know, debris just falling onto the carriageway, which is not really a good outcome there. All right, I've got this other product here, and I might give out a prize if anyone can guess the name of this product. And the clue is it's named after an animal that looks similar. So what animal are you seeing when you see that little fella there? And the cool thing about them is it's made of 100% recycled plastic. So it's quite a cool little, you know, sustainable product to be implementing on projects. And the correct answer is these are called the friendly, my slides are working, armadillo. Just a reminder if anyone forgot what an armadillo looked like. So well done to the first person that said armadillo. I also see like a bee, not an armadillo, but it's just the product that they've gone for. They can also be in white. These ones are called the zebra. I don't think they really do a great job at all of separating the bicycle lane and the adjacent traffic lane, particularly the black and white, because that blends in perfectly with our black pavement and white line marking. So it's not very easy to see. They're not very high off the ground either. So not a sensational treatment when you're looking at separations, but you could argue that they do provide some type of warning, particularly if a vehicle was straying out of their lane. Like, they would certainly notice that they're running over these type of features. So it'd be better than line marking alone, but it's not to the same extent as what we were seeing before with actual physical protection. Just a few more examples of some separators. These kind of ideas of, you know, using flexible paddles and things like that. I actually like that idea. Anything that's a bit more vertical, a little bit higher up, it's a bit easier for a motorist to be able to see and good at delineating the space. So I think that provides a better outcome there. It's just another example of, you know, that combination of a bolt down treatment and then also some type of vertical delineation in that space. This is actually quite a cool example because, well, prior to COVID, this was, as you could probably have guessed, and just another traffic lane that went over this bridge. And cyclists prior to that point had a bicycle lane, and then over this bridge had nothing, and then the bicycle lane started again. So it's just one of those instances where it's just like, good luck, do whatever you can. So mostly it meant cyclists had to come up onto this footpath, which is incredibly narrow, and lots of pedestrians travel in both directions. So it was a really poor outcome, really. During COVID and the variety of lockdowns that we had, they went for this pop-up bike lane trial, and that is what was trialed and is still currently installed at this location. So I, for one, am very supportive of the trial. I think it's just an awesome outcome. And that is an arterial road. So that is, you know, a very, very important strategic corridor for the movement of traffic and the like. But recognize that that is also a very weak spot within the cycling corridor. And I think they've done a pretty good job at, realizing the benefits that protected bicycle lanes can add. So yeah, just another thing to keep in mind. I had a question earlier on just regarding the minimum widths of our separators adjacent a parking lane. And believe it or not, this is a parking lane. There's no vehicles there currently because it's a clear way, but during the day you can park there. And you can see, well, it's about 1/2 meter or so. It's certainly not wide enough to encompass, a vehicle door. So I would say that, there are examples across the network where smaller separator widths have been employed, have been installed, designed and installed. However, I don't think it is to the benefit of cyclists. I don't think that becomes a comfortable environment for cyclists. In other words, the reason that we're, so strong and so passionate about our protected bicycle lanes is because they do virtually eliminate the risk of dooring. And the more that you get into the space of trying to, take more and more away from that separator, the more you're increasing the risk of dooring occurring and reducing the effectiveness of the treatment altogether. So I've also seen an example where there was no separator. I didn't include that in this slide. It was just like a bike lane here and then a parking lane. Wacky. Marissa.
Max, we have a question. Does the speed environment dictate the type of separator used?
Yeah, good question. So I haven't seen a specific guide that would state, use this particular type of separator for this speed environments. So it would certainly be dependent on what materials are available and, what are the design funding constraints as well, because different products have different prices. In saying that, as we get into higher and higher speeds, what we are actually looking at is off-road facilities altogether. So we have a slide coming up which would suggest what type of cycling treatments you would apply in different speeds. But as we're getting into higher environments, we'd want to have a bicycle lane that is well and truly offset from our carriageway.
Thank you.
No worries. All right. It is time for our little segment of what's wrong with this photo. So we can see a confused cyclist there popping up his head. We'll get rid of him. Anyone want to pop in the chat as what they may see wrong with this photo or what's perhaps a risk in this photo? I'll give you a minute just to have a go with that one. Feel free to get up and have a stretch if you'd like.
Lots of great answers coming through, Max.
Yeah, that's right. So the answer I certainly was looking for is the dooring risk, which is bang on. That's exactly what I'm concerned about within this environment. But we'll also give a prize out there, Marissa, to the person that noticed. They said pedestrians, which is a pretty good eyesight, but it's actually someone on a skateboard and a scooter as well in the bike lane. So very, very good vision there. But yeah, the actual risk that I'm most concerned about within that space is a dooring risk. So all those protected bicycle lane discussion that we've just been having, not applicable to that image. So when we think about dooring, as I mentioned before, the door can swing out approximately 1.2 meters from the vehicle. So it is important to leave buffer from our parking lane to the bicycle lane. I'll share this video. Hopefully the internet will be kind and play it. This is actually our colleague slash principal slash chief at Safe System Solutions, Ken Beer, riding his bicycle and someone just opening their car door adjacent to the bicycle lane. And Ken was lucky enough to be quite speedy with his reactions and avoid that, but you can see it wasn't far off to becoming, you know, a collision there, which could have been some broken bones. So that's the kind of risk that we are talking about. And something where that educational campaign that I was talking about before with the Dutch reach, if you actually use your opposite arm to open the door and, you know, force to look for bikes, that's one way to deal with it. Not saying that education campaigns are the only solution we have. We do have protected bicycle lanes also within our arsenal to use. Oh, there we go. This was a funny little graph that was produced that basically looked at all the dooring collisions that have occurred with cyclists. I say funny because it basically just told us that most of them are occurring on the driver's side, which is not that surprising considering you need a driver to drive the vehicle. So there's always going to be someone there. And generally all of our bicycle lanes are on this side. So not incredibly thought-provoking stuff there, but I suppose something that may catch your eye is, well, there still is a reasonably high proportion occurring on the left-hand side or the passenger side. And you might be thinking, how does that occur? This one is most likely where you've got a cyclist that could be weaving in between traffic, which is legal, I should add. So say the vehicle stopped at the lights and the passenger wants to get out and they've got a cyclist that's weaving in that space and the passenger just opens their door. It's just an example of how that type of crash could occur. But yeah, that's basically the driver's side is where the majority of trauma is occurring. We've provided this little, means of, this reference to use if you are looking at, well, what can we do within the space to reduce the risk of car dooring? It's, a fairly high level figure and doesn't necessarily explain things in great detail, but basically one of the takeaways is regardless of the road use, so that's the road use on the first column there, if it's a bus priority or general traffic or whatever it is, off-road paths, protected bicycle lanes are deemed appropriate. So they're always worth investigating as an option. Relocation of cyclists where it is a bicycle priority route is unlikely to be appropriate. So once again, not incredibly thought-provoking stuff, but something that may help gauge your decision-making. There was this trial done in Victoria on Glenferrie Road where they just painted this little narrow strip of green. Hopefully that's coming up on your screen, but it's basically just this little part here. Only that's painted green as opposed to painting the entire bicycle lane. The intent of this trial was hopefully we'll get cyclists moving away from the dooring zone, which on the other hand means it's closer to general traffic and closer to light rail or trams. However, that was the intent of the trial. The evaluation of this showed that riders did take a while to adjust to this, but there was an actual lateral shift. So there was a noted shift in cyclists rather than riding closer to the dooring zone. They were using that. So did achieve that objective. The other interesting thing is motorists were giving them more room as well, and they were shifting across as well. So not saying that this is by all means what we should be advocating in all our spaces, but just an interesting little trial. Anecdotally, 75% of cyclists surveyed said they felt more comfortable riding within this space than what was previously there, which was just traditional bicycle lanes. So take that at face value, I suppose. But yeah, just an interesting treatment that was installed on Glenferrie Road, and I should say is also still there today. This was a similar, oh, sorry, Marissa.
No, that's okay. We've just got a few comments and a question. A comment from Chris, we should mandate gull-wing doors. Goldwing, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
And Melanie Parsons from, I'm assuming this comment is in relation to the video from Ken. We've got, that's almost a Smidsy. Sorry, mate, I didn't see you. So
very good. Yes.
I like that one very much. Yes. We do have a question from Len. What are your thoughts on e-scooters?
Okay, how long have you got, Len? It's quite a complicated topic. I'm not one that would be a strong advocate or dismissive of the idea either. I think it's going to be part of the transport network. I don't think that they belong on footpaths because of the speeds they can reach. So it kind of makes sense to put them on bike paths. I love the idea of geofencing them, and in areas where there are riskier activities or there's lots of pedestrians or anything like that, physically slowing down those e-scooters or any other e-skateboards and the like. So I like that aspect of it, but I do see it as an inevitable part of our transport network, and so that's why I'm not dismissive. I think we just need to work out what is the best way to deal with the new technologies that are coming our way. Very, very popular. Very popular where I live in Frankston, actually. So you see them all the time. This one was in New Zealand, sorry, just another trial that is occurring currently. And it's this idea of just doing dotted little green line marking to say that this is a bicycle lane. The intent is not for cyclists to ride on the line marking that is shown in this photo. So sorry for that confusion. It's just like a continuous reminder for vehicles driving along here. This is a bicycle lane and not a shoulder. I'm not 100% sure how effective that will be, but I guess we'll determine once the evaluation is released. But you can achieve a similar means by, just putting the bicycle pavement symbol every 200 meters or so, I would think. But who knows, maybe this is incredibly effective. If we are looking at on-road bicycle lanes, so if we're unable to put our protected bicycle lanes in, you would argue probably the next best thing would be this type of treatment referred to as a double chevron, which is basically just painted line marking or a buffer both on the parking side as well as the live traffic side. So there's just some technical details there for those within the design space, but basically just providing that buffer on both sides, so creating an extra width for cyclists to be able to ride comfortably. Here's an example of where you've only got the chevron on the parking lane side of things, and I can see Chris's question there that's come up with which side would you put it on, and it's beautifully timed, Chris. Thank you very much, because it is coming up. So do we put the chevron on this side or do we put it on the other side? So current guidelines within the City of Melbourne suggest if you have a high turnover of parking, so if that is in a 2-hour zone or less, for instance, and you're expecting multiple doors to be opening throughout the day, that would increase the risk of a door and collision. Makes sense? So that's when you'd put chevron on that side. Conversely, if it was all day parking, could be residential, and that's when you may be more concerned about a collision with a general traffic entering the bicycle lane, and that's when you'd put the chevron on this side. So that's the guidance that's currently out there. I do still think it requires a case-by-case basis. For instance, you know, in a straight geometry like that, I can understand where, you know, having it just on the parking side makes sense. But if this was curved and there's a greater risk of motorists tracking into the bicycle lane, then you might advocate, no, we need to put the chevron buffer adjacent that just to allow for those swept paths. It's got this example here of another one in New Zealand of the chevron being installed. This one is on the traffic lane side, and just some more design details for those working within the space. Another treatment, this is, I suppose, the way bicycle lanes have been built throughout the last decades, sorry, for many decades now, which is basically just a little bit of line work. So just a solid line to say that's the bicycle lane, and where there's conflict points, you may highlight them in green and just have a little bicycle pavement. I'm very much an advocate for, if you ever have the space for an exclusive bike lane, then there must be some space for some form of separation. So there must be some type of space that you can, you know, allow for some degree of separation, looking at the variety of products that we look for. And I would say that any of those products would be better than just having a single line as your means of separation. So yeah, that's probably the takeaway I'd give you from that. The last type of example that I'll give you is this idea of a wide curbside lane, sometimes referred to as like a little breadcrumbs approach. Like every 200 meters, you just have ... bicycle symbol, and everything in between is just, it just looks like a wide traffic lane, doesn't it? I think this is terrible, and I don't think we should be implementing this at all. I don't think it serves cyclists whatsoever. This particular example is in an 80-kilometer environment. And it's also, as you see, on a curve, as well as the vertical curvature. So cyclists will be traveling slow to get up the hill, and motorists will be traveling very fast, and it's a terrible design. So we shouldn't be going for that at all. I'll hop into our next environment. Marissa, sorry, got any more questions?
We do have a couple of questions. Would you not do a risk assessment? Risk equals severity times exposure.
Absolutely. You can always do a risk assessment to work out which option, you know, base case, what would be better. So chevrons on that side, chevrons on that side, or wide curbside lane versus exclusive bike lane, etc. You could do a road safety audit to compare those. You could do a safe system assessment, or you could develop a risk framework to analyze that. Yep.
Yeah, we have a comment from Chris, paint is not infrastructure. And a question, how far apart would you suggest between each bicycle pavement marking?
Yeah, it's in the Australian standards. Can't remember at the top of my head. I'm going to say between 150 and 200 meters, something like that. Just dotted along, but also at every opening to a minor street and things like that, just to reiterate. So vehicles coming off the minor street, no, okay, that's a bike lane.
Great, thank you.
All right. This was the speed and bicycle infrastructure treatment plan that I was talking about before. So where we're in the space of less than 40 kilometers per hour, generally lane sharing is okay. I will caveat that with saying, for those that are familiar with, I suppose, our crash risk curves, there's a few different names for them, but if you're a vulnerable road user and we had speed along the x-axis and the probability of a fatality along the y, the relationship for a vulnerable road user, so for a cyclist, as speed goes up, the risk of a fatality also goes up. Makes sense. But the way that it actually works is there's a point in time where things get exponentially worse, which is about this point here. this happens to coincide with the speed of 30 kilometers per hour. So in an ideal world, if you were looking at lane sharing or cyclists claiming the traffic lane, you'd ideally want to bring it to speeds of 30 kilometers per hour. And I will just maybe circle that because that might come in handy for a quiz later on. However, we acknowledge that we generally don't have many 30-kilometer networks. You know, like they're popping up here and there, but you wouldn't say that they are a common feature of our network. 40 kilometers are slightly more common, particularly in inner urban areas, in inner urban cities. And yeah, so at the moment, there is guidelines to suggest that less than 40 kilometers is appropriate for lane sharing, but recognizing that 30 kilometers or even less would be a much better outcome for cyclist safety. So sorry for that little bit of a rant, but hopefully that makes a bit of sense. So anything less than 40, lane sharing. We're getting faster than 40, in between 40 and 60, then that's when we look at our protected bicycle lanes. So separating bicycle lanes. Anything greater than 60, off-road bicycle paths. So we are miles away from achieving that. We have highways that allow cyclists to ride on the shoulder, which are at 100 or 110. So take that at, I suppose, face value, that this is what we are aspiring towards, and this is what we should use at the start of our projects, and can be used to leverage. Well, maybe if I am unable to achieve, you know, I'm unable to build a protected bicycle lane within the space that I'm using, which is 50 kilometers per hour. Maybe I bring down the speed to 40, and then I can build a shared space. So that's another way that you could use this. The idea of mixing traffic or sharing the traffic lanes is achieved through the use of these things called a sharrow, just called a shared arrow, and it is an acknowledgement for both motorists and cyclists that bicycles can now claim the traffic lane. So in other words, cyclists, you don't have to ride to the left-hand side, you'd have to ride near the curb. You can ride right in the middle of the traffic lane because you're just like any other vehicle in that space. Here's an example of just a sharrow being used in this particular environment. I chose this one because this is actually within a 30 kilometer per hour limits. Oh, Marissa, sorry, but any questions there?
Yeah, no, that's okay. We've just got a few questions. Do you advocate banning cyclists on high-speed roads if there is no room to provide a bike facility?
Yeah, all right, that's a great question. So in metropolitan Melbourne, there is an outright ban on cyclists on freeways. So that's just standard, and everyone seems to kind of understand that. If you were to apply that to regional remote areas, you would have significant upset from the cycling communities that use those networks for training or getting from towns to towns. So I'm generally not a fan of blanket reform. I mean, yes, in terms of safe system thinking, would it reduce the risk of collisions and trauma occurring? Yes, but there would also be that social aspect of I'm now, you know, penning cyclists into a network that they can only use, which could be not where they want to travel. So challenging question.
Yes, challenging. Thanks, Chris. Keeping you on your toes today. And Melanie says cyclists or cycling can only be banned on motorways in New Zealand.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, there you go. Do you have any thoughts or undertaken any investigations on road space reallocation to reallocate cycling infrastructure for roads with a posted speed of 60 kilometers per hour or above?
So the way I'm reading that is like, yeah, any projects that we worked on where we've kind of transformed a road, which could have been existing solely for general traffic and then has moved into something which is similar to the, I suppose, that bridge photo that I showed before of like, that was obviously only there to cater general traffic and heavy vehicles, but during COVID decided that no, cyclists can have a lane there as well. So yes, we've worked on those projects. In terms of evaluations, I'm sure we would have produced reports. I can try and dig that up in our library and send that on. If you could leave me a note for that, Marissa.
Sure, not a problem.
Thank you, Andy. No worries. All right, so just looking at the time, I've got a few more slides to get through, and I wanted to also talk about our assignment, so I might just get through these remaining slides. And any questions, feel free to email me offline. This is another 30-kilometre zone with Sharrows, and this one's actually in a regional town. So this is not in Melbourne, this is in Warrnambool. Doing excellent things out there in Warrnambool. So shout out to Warrnambool. Just another example of where these are appropriate to be installed. This one is not an appropriate example, and I might quickly throw over to the chat if anyone could suggest why I would say this is not an appropriate example for Sharrows. Yes, 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 yes. Okay, everyone sees that those are tram tracks or light rail, depending on where you come from. And they are a significant risk for tyre entrapment or getting your tyres stuck in there. So the recommendation is if cyclists do have to cross over them, they should be crossing over them at an angle no less than 70 degrees, whereas this would suggest you'd be crossing that at a very acute angle, meaning it's incredibly likely that tyres will get stuck in there, which means cyclists will fall off their bike. So we don't want that one. I should also clarify that that lasted about a week before cyclists complained, and then that got scrubbed off the surface. Another example of where Sharrows are not appropriate. This is in Canada, of all places. Just thought I'd throw another example out there. Just in a really busy multi-lane environment. It is 50 kilometers, so it's not, it looks a lot faster, but it's 50 kilometers, but not an appropriate spot. Just also given it's also a parking lane that this right-hand side is in, so cyclists would be forced to kind of go around parked vehicles. Not a good example. So when we are looking at implementing Sharrows, we want to make sure that we have local area traffic management treatments that support that speed zone. In other words, we don't want to make it likely for vehicles to reach operating speeds above that 40 kilometre per hour that we were talking about. So things like, you know, just traditional speed humps or slow points or whatever it is to slow down general traffic, make sure that they can't get to higher speeds is imperative. So they need to be used in conjunction. It's not just putting up some signs and hoping that's it. The reason I included this one is actually in Adelaide. As an example, is you've got this cut through for cyclists. So cyclists don't have to worry about slowing down for the hump. Cyclists get a nice, smooth, continuous journey. So good on you, Adelaide. Good thinking. Similar practice there in New Zealand as well. Another local area traffic management treatment you can look at, it's a little bit difficult to see from this angle, so I'll go to an aerial, is providing these like cut-throughs or partial road closures for vehicles. So that is in orange, that is the path a vehicle would be required to take to continue through. So heading south on that page, which is, as you can see, pretty inconvenient. And this was a very, very common rat run area. So it's been deliberately installed to make it less permeable. It's the way it's usually described. However, the cyclist does not have to go that roundabout way. They can head straight through. The annoying part of this is you've actually just introduced 2 conflict points that were not there before. So that's I suppose, one of the disadvantages of this particular example. But overall, the rat running in this area has, you know, dramatically decreased. So it's achieved that aim for certain. A better example on this exact same road is a little bit further south, where it's a full road closure. So general traffic are unable to head south through there. It's all been built out. They have to head back north and go left and get back onto the arterial network, which is where they should be. However, cyclists are able to head straight through there. So I love these ideas. It's something that the Netherlands in particular do really, really well. They make it more difficult to get from A to B if you're in a car within a local network, okay? If you're on the arterial network, yep, they can all connect up. They connect up onto freeways, no problem. Once you're in a local network, say, for instance, you know, your suburb versus the suburb that's next to you, rather than just being able to cut through all the side streets to get there, you'd be forced within Netherlands as an example, you'd be forced to actually get on arterials, take a highway, if that, depending on the distance, and then get back onto arterials to reach a destination. So yeah, it's just about creating less permeability within our local area network, which I think is a very sensible idea. Okay, that is the end of the session, but as I mentioned, I did want to have a quick chat about assignments for the end of today. Just a few things not to do, as I like to end my presentations. Not to provide any barriers where you are proposing for cyclists to access. They did the right thing and at least provided a bit of a curb ramp, but failed to meet the brief whole way. Temporary traffic management as well. That's a really, really big one for cyclists. It's incredibly common to see this type of arrangement where bicycle lanes are just shut and then there's nothing further. Actually, I've got an example next module of it as well, but yeah, having, if you are within the temporary traffic management space or you are delivering projects adjacent existing bike lanes, have a think about how is that cyclist's journey going to be continued, because that is a real pain for cyclists. Okay, I'll now share my screen. Is that still sharing there,
Yeah,
Marissa?
absolutely is. Yep, definitely.
It's on the LMS.
Yeah, yep, we can see that.
Great, that's excellent. Okay, so under module 2, you'll see there is another VR 360-degree video. So first thing we'll get you to do is have a flick through that, just like module 1. Click on that, scroll around on the screen, just have a look at different on-road bicycle treatments. So you'll get a look at a protected bicycle lane and you'll also get a look at a traditional bicycle lane. And if you've never actually cycled in those two different environments, I will give you a bit of perspective as to how different it feels riding in those two examples. So strongly encourage that. Instead of a quiz today, we have got an assignment instead. So I probably should have started and mentioned that there was no Wally the Wombat. There was no Wally sign in that module in case you were trying to work out where Wally was. Yes, sorry about that. I should have said that at the start. So there was no Wally today.
We'll make up for it for next module 3.
Wally will be back, I promise. The module 2 assignment includes this Word document as well as this PDF. So I've already got those documents open. So I'll just I'll just move them across. So the PDF is actually a design set. It is a concept plan in Launceston to do with cycling infrastructure. And there is a little disclaimer in red, just noting that this is for training purposes. So please don't call up the Launceston mayor and ask them what's going on York Street, because this is just meant to help with your education in this field. So just a little reminder. So there's only 4 sheets here. If you've never looked at plans before and this looks a little bit unclear, please just get in touch and we can schedule some arrangement to make sure that it's as clear as possible. So that's the PDF that comes with module 2 assignment. The actual assignment itself is this Word document. So I'll just go through the steps just so it's clear. The first step is download and review the Module 2 design review. That was the PDF file I just showed you. Step 2, review the existing conditions of the site using Google Street View. So if you just click on that link there, it will take you to York Street in Launceston. You can just have a quick, spin around and go up and down York Street, just so you get a feel of what that environment looks like for those that have never been. Step 3, fill out the table provided below. So there's some questions and we require your responses. Step 4, save and upload this document onto the LMS. So right where I downloaded everything, there'll also be an option for you to upload. And if you can either upload this as a Word document or as a PDF, whatever is preferable. Then we get a notification to say this participant has uploaded their assignment and we can then mark it. So that just helps that process in place. Okay, so that's how we don't do anything by emails or anything. Everything is through the LMS. The questions that we want you to answer, the first question is, how does the existing environment cater for cyclists? Another way to phrase that would be, what cycling infrastructure exists? Okay. Question number 2, how does the design cater for cyclists? So you'll need to flick through the design and work out, well, what are the changes specifically for cyclists? So what are the changes, hopefully making things better for cyclists? So you just list them out. All of these, happy with dot points. We don't need paragraphs or anything like that. Keep it short and brief, succinct, that's fine. We're mostly interested to see if you're using the correct terminology. So reflect back on today's module. Make sure you're using the correct terms, the correct jargon, and that will make sure that you're getting pass marks for these ones. The third one is the one where we tend to have the most challenges, but hopefully we'll get everyone across the line for today. But what treatments/changes in the design could you recommend to improve the safety for cyclists? So it is a bit long-winded, I'll admit that. But basically, we're just asking, if you were designing this or changing the design and you had 3 things you'd change about it, what would you do? Okay, so we do want to keep it relating to infrastructure. So, for instance, if your suggestion was ban all cars, you'd be technically correct. That would improve cyclist safety, but it's not really the answer that we're looking for. So we want to keep it within the bicycle infrastructure space. So if you are at a loss for any ideas, first point of call would be today's modules, because we have touched on a few treatments that could be implemented. If it's still not clear though, please reach out and we will make sure that we can make it as clear as possible for you. So we have allowed a few extra minutes at the end of today just to watch the 360-degree video. Is there any, did I cover everything there, Marissa? Or do you think that was clear for everyone?
Yeah, no, I think so. Maybe we'll just mention when they've got to submit it by the next session, or?
Yeah, it's actually, so we've allowed 1 week to submit module 2 assignments. So if you are able to do that prior then, that'd be fantastic. If you're able to do it before Tuesday, that'd be great, because then I can, chat through any issues that may be coming up, but acknowledge everyone's got their own work lives and demands. So just, by next Thursday would be fantastic.
Yep, perfect. And if you do have any issues accessing the LMS, please shoot me an email or let me know and we can fix that up for you, no problem.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you everyone for the session today and providing your input. Lots of excellent discussion. So thanks for being involved, and we'll see you next Tuesday for Module 3.
Great. See you, everyone.
See you later.